Bueno, 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 bueno. Bueno, 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 bueno.
Te pido por favor, desde el principio que empieces a hablar, te comento, se transmite en vivo en YouTube, se va a cargar. Por lo tanto, todo lo que se hable tiene que ser en micrófono para que se escuche claramente. Micrófono y empiezas a hablar. Cada vez que tú, o sea, cuando empiezas a dar la explicación de las reglas y la explicación de la introducción,
Perdón, Héctor, ¿podríamos escuchar también qué están diciendo para todos entender sus reglas? Sí, sí. No, no son reglas, son aclaraciones de nada.
Haremos una oración antes de iniciar el debate. Por favor, toda Jesús por María. Vamos a seguir en compañía. Welcome everyone to this table of debate. We kindly ask you to remain silent and in your seat. In order that the debate we can start. Also to remind you that once we have started, no one can leave the room until the closing. Please turn off all your mobile devices. Nadie puede salir del salón hasta que termine el debate. Deben permanecer en silencio en sus lugares. Cualquier dispositivo electrónico que vea será sancionado la persona una vez. La siguiente lo tendré que retirar de esto. Va para lo mismo como para el juez, público y de también. ¿Estamos de acuerdo? Welcome everybody to this national debate encounter the L'Héritage 2008. For the purpose of introducing the judge and part of his current curriculum, we will read the name and the intro. Today, here with us is Arica Lev Lazaro Oribe, licensed in psychology and promoter, an assistant in sexual diversity, activist, and a professional as a transgender. And also would like to introduce the table speakers. On my right hand, this is the violin. On my left hand, is actually No, no, yes, okay. Now we will ruffle the postures. Favor posture. Against the posture. The theme today is allow minors to change legal gender without parental consent. Transgender youth run a gauntlet of challenges on a daily basis. Those who are fortunate enough to live and present as their authentic gender are faced with discrimination in workplaces, schools, faith communities, the internet, their own homes, and general public spaces. Prejudice, sexual and physical violence, and the constant threat thereof, verbal abuse, and much more. But not all transgender individuals are even this lucky. Some are still forbidden by their parents or legal guardians from wearing the hair, makeup, and clothing of their preference, dating the gender of their preference, and going by gender appropriate first and middle names and pronouns. Some are even buried as their assigned gender in direct opposition of their wishes. It is urgent to enact a federal legislation affording the right to transgender youth to change their legal gender through a convenient, affordable, and widely accessible process. This decision must be outside the influence of parents or legal guardians, and may be reversed by the individual at a later date, but that our parents or guardians may not appeal either decision at any time, under any circumstance except via delivery of notarized paperwork expressing the individual's sincere wishes to do so. This transition must be fully functional, providing all the rights and allowances afforded to those assigned the individual gender of choice at birth, and should remain effective until reversed. I ask. Now that the debate rules have been established, let me remind you the general rules of the debate. The maximum number of the participants is 5. There should not be more than 3 speakers and 2 researchers. The members of each team can have printed information, which includes books, sheets of paper, flashcards, dictionary, etc. For argumentation, it is completely forbidden to use any electronic devices such as laptops, mobiles, and tablets. The communication between the members of each team must be exclusively written. Therefore, oral communication will be fine, just as making fun of the other team, verbally or with gestures, as well as shouts or hitting the table, are forbidden behaviors during the debate. The moderator must inform the judge about the willful misconduct of the team. Any quotation should have a maximum of 3 lines and must be accompanied with the inference of the debater who mentioned it. With all these rules already mentioned, we will go to the next stage of the debate, which is the exposition of the opening statement. Starts in favor team. You got up to 4 minutes to speech. Okay. When I said. Ah, sorry. You're allowed to start. 3, 2, 1.
To stimulate life, leaving it free, however to unfold itself. That is the first duty of an educator. Maria Montessori. Good morning, honorable judge, moderator, opposite team, and general audience that is here with us. Today we're here to debate the topic, which is allow minors to change legal gender without parental consent. And in this case, our team is going to defend the proposition posture, which means that we're going to be in favor of this topic. First of all, so we can have a better understanding about what we're debating, we are going to define 3 main concepts. The first one would be minors, which will be defined as one who has not reached the set age on the law to enjoy full legal capacity. This according to the Dictionary of Judicial, Political, and Sociological Sciences by Manuel Osorio. Then we're going to define should, which will be defined as the necessity of an action with regard of a moral law. This according to Immanuel Kant, a philosopher, and it's right on the Critics of Pure Reason. And finally, we're going to define legal gender as the recognition that it describes how countries recognize a person's gender identity, this according to Open Society Foundation. Then, in this case, we're going to have a proposal for this debate, which will be that a minor can change its gender just if it passes for psychological assessing and a confirmation by a professional that is actually, the minor is actually having gender dysphoria or some kind of related thing that that happens when someone is transgender. Then, to give a little bit of context, I'm going to talk about the LGBT community, which faces a lot of vulnerability in the actuality. And specifically talking about transgender youth and transgender people, the rates of suicide and depression between transgender people is very high. Second of all, I'm going to talk about the big elephant in the room. What is gender? And yes, this is a very controversial topic. That is why we're debating it today. Gender is something really different than sex. And let me explain why. Sex are all the things that have to do with biological things, which are genitals, chromosomes, etc., hormones. And gender is something which we will define as, in a human context, the distinction between gender and sex is that gender refers as psychological, behavioral, social, and cultural aspects of being masculine or feminine. Just a quick example is that animals don't have a label to define the gender, but humans do. And finally, I'm going to make questions so we can have a good debate. The first one would be, by applying this measure, can we get benefits? And benefits from who? For transgender youth, for the state, for the parents, and finally for the society. Thank you.
Judge, time was 3 minutes, 8 seconds. Now, please.
Good morning, jury, moderator, of course, opposite table, and everybody here that accompanies us. Today, we will state and defend why it is completely incorrect to let underage people to go through sex reassignment surgery and to make the decision to become transgender legally without parental consent. First of all, sex change surgery. Sex change surgery is a desperate way to try to fulfill a non-existent necessity, becoming someone you are not. But it is morphia. It's a mental disorder that all transsexual people suffer and that wants to be expressed physically, just like anorexia. This doesn't mean for sure it is correct or moreover healthy for the person. Imagine letting a black person bleach his skin just because he's not comfortable in his own, knowing that this could cause medical complications or issues like skin cancer. As a doctor, this would be totally unethical and unprofessional and a huge, huge aberration. We're all born with a sex determined by nature, with millions of years perfectioning. Changing the appearance does not change the genetical information contained inside the chromosomes, which is the one that truly defines you. Added to all of this, we're dealing with underage people. People that are not legally able to make decisions. Why? Because they do not have enough maturity and enough mental development to make such an important decision in their lives. This decision is also negative because for a person to go under this dangerous procedure, they need to start a biological hormonal process in order to block it and then to start a brand new different one. This is totally wrong because it could definitely cause an enormous body imbalance, of course, a dramatic trauma, and infertility. Let us also mention that nothing ensures that the patient will be satisfied with the results of his new morphology. Indeed, it could also enhance the will to change, risking mental health. There is the limit, people, and letting an underage person to go through this important decision and to have sex reassignment surgery when they are still minors without parental consent is completely wrong. This, and for more reasons to be discussed during the debate, we're completely against letting underage people to go through sex reassignment surgery and to choose their gender and change it legally without parental consent. Thanks everybody for your kind attention.
Time was 2 minutes, 45 seconds. I ask you both to please take your watch off. Okay. Next, we're going to start the second part of this debate, the question, answer, and replica question section. The dynamic is the following. One of the speakers, his, her, to ask a question. All of the members of the opposite table can raise their hand to answer it. Right away, all the speaker of the table team that asked the question can replicate the answers made by the other team. As a reminder, the debaters must keep their hands raised in this position, please. In order for me to know whether you still want to participate or no, or not. Now, we start with a question of the opposition team.
Opposite table, would you kindly tell us what are the post-operative complications of sex reassignment surgery?
Yes, in most cases, it happens some sort of not being able to have kids, and it has hormonal disbalance, and all what you just said is correct. But let me tell you something really important. Talking about this topic is that the topic of this debate is allowing minors to change legal gender, and legal gender does not has it's intrinsic of changing sexual gender. It's something really different. As I mentioned before, and you didn't rebuttal on your introduction, I mentioned that legal gender was the recognition of the state of the gender's identity, and that doesn't have to do with sexual reassignment.
The first thing we're talking about is we are not talking about anything related to the hormonal or the chirurgical change of sex, but the legal change of gender. So anything related to transsexuality, as you mentioned it, is irrelevant to this debate.
Okay, from this side of the debate, we think it's really important to not just center the cases on sexual reassignment. We already mentioned that this isn't really going into this debate because, of course, they never mentioned it on the rebuttals, on the opening statement. But we do have to consider something, and it's not only the prejudices that might come, but also the benefits, and that's the point we're going to defend ourselves. And for that, let me plant you the first argument, the benefits for the minors. And the point of this argument is one very simple, that if we allow the children to change their gender, these people can feel better than they did before due the following mechanisms. Okay, so we have to take into account that transgender children are vulnerable. And they suffer from a problem that we already mentioned, and you two mentioned, which is discrimination. And through allowing these persons to change their legal gender and be recognized and identified as something they really do are, because we're not talking, I think it's really disrespectful to call them something that they are not. If they feel identified with an ideology, then we just can't let them be, because it doesn't go against anybody. And the point of this is, okay, if transgender people feel recognized with what they really are, then it's a benefit in contraposition with how they felt before.
Well, first of all, opposite table, you just debated our question. And of course, we're talking about chirurgical procedures too, because it comes along. It was the topic of the debate, and we'll just give you the fact that you didn't answer. 2.6% of patients present rectovaginal wall perforations. 37% of these patients had repeated compressive dressings. 15% of these patients required blood transfusion. 18% presented hematoma, and 27% of them presented early infection complications. We should not allow minors to go through this incredibly big amount of danger without parental consent.
Also, Positivo, for your information, it was indeed mentioned in the convocatory that we will debate about transsexual, and a transsexual is one who has gone through the surgery. So please pay attention to that. Also, you mentioned, you talked about something that wasn't related to a question, so please focus on what we ask. And although your opinion is important, you should stick to facts and avoid telling us what you think, because that's not quite important in this debate. We need facts.
Yes. First, is one question, but with two variants. Can you repeat the exact motion that the moderator said? And can you give me the definition of legal gender?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Can you repeat the topic which we're debating that the moderator just said? And can you tell us the definition of legal gender?
Well, Positivo, legal gender is the gender that is that appears in the legal documents, and to which you are referred to in every document that is established by the law. Also, well, the counterpart of this debate states that children should not be allowed to become transsexuals when minors, and not without the permission of their parents. And that's actually right, because without consent, that's not right at all.
So if you like, I would like to read again the term legal gender. This describes how countries recognize a person's gender identity. Gender identity, again, not sex. And the gender itself defines itself as the being male, female, or neuter. And the gender differentiates itself from sex, that sex refers to the biological aspects of maleness or femaleness. And the gender implies psychological, behavioral, and social and cultural aspects of being male or female. So the legal gender is itself the way a person is identified psychologically, behaviorally, socially, and all of the things. Because our topic, as I read it textually, is allow minors to change legal gender without parental consent. It is not transsexual kids, because that it wouldn't be fair to the debate, because we all know that there are a lot of facts that don't, because we all know that the surgeries performed on kids make no sense. So.
Positivo, if we do not let minors to buy alcohol, drive, or vote because the brain isn't fully developed, why should we let them reassign their gender legally without their parents' support or consentment?
Yes, basically because this is not the same thing. Changing legal gender is not the same thing as driving, as and they can drive, and as taking alcohol. I mean, it's something like really offensive to compare being transgender to drinking alcohol. And just to clarify something really quick is that you just mentioned that transgender is a disorder, and I just want to correction it really fast. which is gender dysphoria. I'm sorry. Gender dysphoria is a mental disorder that is defined as distress due to one's gender, according to the Psychological American Association.
So we have to take in consideration a point that is really important for this debate, and that completely negates the opposition's posture on transsexuality, because it is in fact prohibited to do legal, it's illegal to do sex change operation on minors. So that it isn't even a point of this debate, because it doesn't enter, it cannot be done. Doctors will not do it, because as you just said, it goes against their morality and against the things that they consider that are important and that are stated, you know, on the ways the doctors work.
And this comparison, I think it's completely wrong, because you are taking, it's taking the, I could say the bad things that could happen to children, but actually changing the legal gender could mean a benefit rather than a prejudice, like drinking alcohol or driving or those kinds of stuff, because it doesn't represent a risk. It actually represents a benefit in which it can benefit the social acceptance of the transgender kid and or minor, and it could just make him closer to the rights he needs to have access to.
We would like to correct a complete fallacy that the opposite table just made. They say that it's illegal to change sex when you are underage, but actually the treatments start when they are during puberty, so it's not illegal.
Also, opposite table, you evaded a question by talking about a previous question or a previous argument, so please stick to the questions asked and answer to those. Also, it wasn't offensive at all, because we're talking about legal concerns. We're talking about gender in a legal term, just as voting, driving, or drinking. So it's not offensive because it's legal, and we're talking about how it works during this subject. Also, nobody mentioned anything about a disorder, so please try not to put words in our mouths that we did not say, and stick to the subject of the debate, please.
Okay, so is everyone, this could seem like way off the topic, but is it illegal to that someone, well, is marriage, okay, let me do this again. Are all the people that are getting married are mature enough to do so?
Opposite table, people who gets married despite their maturity are already older or over age, and if they are not, they do it with their parents' consent, because that's what is needed when a minor wants to do something illegal when they're not older enough. So they do it with their parents' consent, and if they are mature enough or not to get married, that's their decision, and that's apart from this debate. Please stick to the point. Also, opposite table, as mentioned before, when they do it, they're over the age of being minor, and when they do it under, it's with their parents' permission.
Also, as an extra data, a marriage is about two people. It's a couple, so it's not a self-made decision as being transgender.
Following what my table team just said, it is ridiculous to compare a wet with being transgender.
The point of this question is to remark what the part of the state should do, and the state should protect its citizens. I think that we must agree on that. In a democratic state, it has been said that it is the government of the majorities, but that doesn't mean we have to ignore the minorities, and that's why we're debating this today. And just to clear that out, this question was going to point a very clear point, which was not because some specific individuals don't have the characteristics, for example, to get married, it doesn't mean that anyone should get married. In the case of legal gender, again, legal gender, not sexual reassignment, not because one child is immature to commit this this decision doesn't mean that anyone should do it. And that's why we put the proposal at the first thought, which was if a child is going to go to transgender, if it's going to change its legal gender, it has to pass through a clinical psychological therapy to confirm if it's actually suffering from gender dysphoria. I know you didn't say gender dysphoria, you say transgender is a disease.
So, yes, the point we were trying to make is that the state or the government, in this case, should not take into the consideration the supposedly immaturity of the child, because it is only giving access to a right, to various human rights actually, and it's actually giving a benefit to it, and it's benefiting it itself, the state. So if you want me to read the humans, if you want me to say a few human rights that would be affected, or well, that are being affected by not letting them change their legal gender, it's the Article 3, the Article 2, such as the best interests of the child are a primary consideration, the non-discrimination, the need to respect their capacity to make decisions about the life is Article 5. So the duty of state is to improve that.
Table, would you please tell us what do we need a legal tutor for?
Could you please repeat the question?
What do we need a legal tutor for?
A tutor.
Tutor.
Yes, okay. Okay, so really think it's important to have a tutor because it represents the way that if we put in the position of ourselves as children, then we are not able to decide legally. But our tutor serves for that purpose. And let me take consideration something that is very important, and is how the legal change would work. And this is coming from how the state would do this change that we're talking about. And this would come from something like, okay, if we're talking about a legal gender change, then we would have something like a paper or several papers that change instead of saying male to female or vice versa. And the point of this is that the implications are so important because it can benefit the children feeling more now more identified with that and being better or feeling better. And on the other side, it doesn't cause any harm to anybody, and also it benefits human rights and the other things that my partners just said a few moments.
Yes, legal tutors are used when it happens a legal thing, which would happen in changing legal gender. But let me clarify something. What we need is not only a legal tutor, would be a psychologist tutor. Why? Because he has the knowledge to know if a child is suffering from gender dysphoria, if it really needs to make this transition on the legal spectrum or not. But what I'm trying to say is that legal tutors are used to very strict things, which is the law. And psychological tutors or clinical psychologists are used to know a person's mind, which will have to be the first thing that we need to analyze in this case.
Well, answering to what the opposite table you just said, a tutor is needed for guidance and representation according to the law. So we must stick to the law, not what a psychologist say. It's just a complementation. Opposite table, all minors must have one. It is not correct to skip their authority. We're not saying it's just paperwork. We know what legal changes are. We just are against people, in this case minors, doing a change without a parent or tutor consent. And it's not correct to skip their authority when they are incapable to make decisions.
quoting the opposite table. Our tutor serves for that purpose. Exactly, just like you said. Our tutor serves to help us decide and move through the legal world, to say it somehow. And exactly, it is needed because minors are not allowed and shouldn't be allowed to make the legal decisions by their own, because it carries along so many things that children and minors are not able to understand yet and to live with yet, which is why the tutors are needed and the parents' consentment, just like you said up at the table, exactly. Tutors are needed, parents' consentment is needed.
Also, the minor would deal with a lot of pressure, not just from the outside, but from the inside as well, because we all have insecurities. And those insecurities would be massive compared, for example, with a cisgender kid or adolescent.
I want to make a question. Please answer yes or no. And it goes back to the propositions or the perspectives that they gave us on the first time. Are you aware that it says that this this legal change can be reversed? And if so, please answer.
First of all, opposite table answers should not be reduced to a yes or no, as they'll carry an explanation. And well, to start with, a minor should not be allowed to do this because, opposite table, as you mentioned in our question, the tutors are needed. You just explained it perfectly. Minors need a tutor or a parent to carry on with the legal procedures. Because, as you mentioned, they can return, yes, but the paperwork is extensive and exhaustive. And well, opposite table, we'd like to state that we're not against being transgender. We're against letting children become legally transgender without parents' consentment. As you just mentioned before, the tutors are needed.
Just to clarify something, I just realized what you were trying to ask, and it was just a misunderstanding about what legal tutor was. We were thinking about legal tutor as a lawyer to help you know what legal implication has to do to get married or to buy a car or whatever. But no, talking about parents, that is what our posture has to define. And when we're talking in any debate, for example, legalization of marijuana, we cannot say, oh, the law doesn't, the law is prohibiting it, so we cannot do it. No, the topic is, should the law do it? And that is why we're debating this today.
Also, we really think it's important to note the contradiction that just happened on the opposite table, because from the beginning they start saying, okay, we should not let children do it because it carries some certain implications that are too wrong for them. But later on the debate, the opposition table mentions we should do it, but only if the parents say so. And this is a clear contradiction because it was stated from the beginning of the debate that they would defend that we shouldn't do it because it's bad. But also that just because something has some negative implications doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It doesn't mean it's bad if they don't give us any connection from that.
Could you tell us the average percentage of people who, when they were minors, were transgender and they grew up and still are transgender, consider themselves as transgender?
Yes, I don't have the exact font, but it's approximately of 70% or so. But let me just repeat what the proposition was, which was if the minor is going to change its legal gender, it must first pass through a clinical psychological therapy, so the psychologist can determine if the minor is actually really sure, if it really has gender dysphoria, if it's not something different. For example, oh, my sister has a special necessities and I'm a boy, and that means that my parents are treating her better, so I must be a girl. No, we're just saying that it has to pass through this process of psychological association, and so the child could be mature enough.
So here we're talking about, yes, okay, you say, well, it's being said that the guardians need to be the ones that decide, And this is not true because the government can help you and can help you cover your necessities and act responsibly according to those necessities. And if your parents could become an obstacle to those necessities, the state has to provide them to you.
Let's make a point really clear. We're talking about using a metric of prejudices against benefits or vice versa to measure how we should or we should not do it. And on the opposition, they never use any metrics to say it's not we shouldn't do it. They just say it's bad, but they never make the connection. And second thing, following this metric that we are using, even if the only prejudice that they have ever been able to mention, which is paperwork, is extensive, even if that exists, it's a higher benefit if we can get identification, visualization of the problem so that we can, after the problem is seen by the society, can be solved and start to work on the solution for that. So there are more benefits than prejudices, which they have only mentioned as far as paperwork being extensive. And following this, we think more benefits equal we should do it.
Well, Opostable, please listen. It never was stated that being transgender was wrong. Never. We were saying, if you didn't listen, that legally transitioning is wrong when there is no parent consent. Also, quoting the Opostable, the child could be mature enough. This means that the child is not mature enough to make a decision on their own. Even though there is a psychological help and psychiatrical help, still the parent consent is needed, because just as you defined it, why a legal tutor is necessary, exactly that's right. Because minors shouldn't be able to decide on their own. What's the problem with it? If the parent considers that it is not right in that moment or in that time or whatever, it's because of something.
Obviously, let's start talking with facts. The brain doesn't fully develop until you are 24 years old. So yes, even though you're having this psychological procedure, you still need time to be fully developed. And the debate topic is about if it should be allowed to be legal without the parents' consent. Not that it's wrong to be transgender. We are not against being transgender. And we are against the transsexual procedure because it's too dangerous when you're a minor. Not that it's wrong, or nor that the people can't do it when they grow up. And also, guardians don't decide. We never say they decide. They guide you and accompany you until you're legal. And if you're still sure about your identity, then you can take the decision and do something about it.
And opposite table, as this is a debate, we would kindly ask you to give facts and not talk about what would happen, please.
If I, as a 17 years old girl, wanted to date a woman, I wanted to have a relationship with a woman, should I ask my parents if they give me consent to date this girl?
Opostable, please stick to the legal matters. Dating someone is not something that should be considered in a legal kind of subject. Also, as we're debating against the Oppostable's whole team, please refer to yourselves as we, because we're not against just one person, but the whole team.
Also, as mentioned before, dating somebody or being in a relationship, it's a decision of two people, and you're not doing anything over your body or over the other person's body.
Well, opposite table, being a lesbian, well, is your business, but being transgender and then transsexual requires the accompaniment of a parental consent. So just let's stick to the topic, please.
Yes, my question was an analogy. I mean, it can look different from this topic, but it's allowed to use analogies. And what I wanted to ask is that in most cases in the LGBT community, what tends to happen is that parents don't accept their child. And they don't accept it because a boy feels like a girl, or it's a girl, or a girl wants to date another girl. That's what happens in the LGBT community. And also to clear something really quick, yes, this is a debate and we must give facts, and I have my investigation, we will talk about it later, but in a debate, we do not only have to make facts of, oh yes, 80% of no, we also have to have reasoning, and of course we must say what each something should or shouldn't be done, or other theoretical things, not only facts.
Okay, so following one of the main points of the opposition table, saying that, for example, it's not dating someone is not a decision that is only made for one person, but rather that is made from two persons. We would kindly present the next things. Your gender expression and identity is not something that is for other person to decide or to put limits or to say you cannot do it. And I think we can agree on everything, that things like your gender, who you like, what you like, are more personal than they are social. And if we make persons such as your tutor, even if they were parents, I can put you the example. If your parent tells you you cannot do something that you really like for example going to a party, I'm pretty sure you will not feel identified, and in some cases that would be some kind of discrimination, and that's precisely what we want to go against as a team, and as of course defending the proposition table.
Okay, according to the UNICEF's Children's Rights and Responsibilities, children have the right to say what they think about something and have the right to to their opinions taken into account into matters that affect them. And by another article, children have the right to privacy. In another article, says that governments should ensure that children are properly cared and are properly protected from violence and from neglect by their parents. So if there is neglect by their parents in accepting the child's identity or in accepting the child's true being and live and freedom and way of life itself, it's the government's duty to give it, even if the parents don't agree.
We will have a 10-minute break. During this time, the advisor of each table will be able to get closer to his student, but without any device or notes. There can be a role switching as long as in the same order in what the debate started. No one is allowed to leave the classroom, not even the judge. The use of mobile phones and electronic devices is forbidden. We're going to make a paréntesis here en español. Público debe mantenerse en silencio, asesores pueden hacer casos exclusivos para ellos, nadie puede salir del salón y debe mantenerse en silencio.
So I want to really make 5 points really clear on this intervention. And the first one is that on the opposite side, they presented something that we really think it's bad, and that is a discriminatory posture. Because it keeps, we have to identify, and this is the second point, that the problem that transgender people are facing and that mostly face is discrimination. And through following this fact that we're not going to allow them, the decision falls on another person, we keep this narrative of discrimination towards them, and that is of course bad, because that is what we're aiming to solve. And also a very important point, and that one of my partners did mention, is the state's responsibility, because the state historically has had trouble and has to a certain extent even discriminated these transgender people, because it hasn't been allowing them to do or to express their sexuality on a right way. And so the point here is that if the state has a responsibility, he made a mistake, then he has to solve it through these mechanisms.
Well, opposite table, first things first, we're not against transgender community, just make this clear. And quoting the exact paper that was sent to all the participants, perspective against, minors should not take such an important decision such as have a sex change operation, as the minor is not mature enough. We are talking about transsexual people as well. So we ask you to please stick to the program.
Also, opposite table, we would like to defend what we said before. We said body dysmorphia, not dysphoria. Dysphoria is a state of feeling unhappy, discomfort with oneself emotionally and mentally. We said dysmorphia, which has to do with the body, not the emotions. And we defend ourselves again, never said disease. We never said disease. Stop arguing and start argumenting. This is a polite encounter. Please stop putting words in our mouths that we didn't say.
Also, opposite table, we have been completely polite during the whole debate. And well, the faces that you've been making can be quite offensive. So please try to keep that under control. Also, you mentioned that people, the minors are discriminated. Well, actually, they are not. Their parents are just making sure that their children make the right decision. That's why they support them and carry on with this if they consider it right. If they don't, they reserve the right to choose and decide, as they are the parents and the legal tutors of the child, which is correct, because the World Professional Association for Transgender Health recognizes that parents' consent is ideal and must not be escaped. We haven't heard any reference from your side or from your facts, so please up the table, not only opinions.
Please, against table, I will make the point of gestures. If I see.
First of all, I'm sorry for our faces. It wasn't towards you, it was towards this part of the debate, which is fluid debate, which was you and us, and I mean opposition and us, not because of you, and we're sorry about it. And just to say it again, I mean, I hope we could pass through this in sometimes. The topic is allow minors to change legal gender without parental consent. And let me explain you something. As I said in my first intervention, gender and sex is something really different. And actually in the sex reassignment is an aesthetical, not a specifically biological thing. It's just a aesthetical theory. But in this topic, we're talking about legal gender. And let me tell you something about the LGBT community. Someone who is transgender isn't necessarily transsexual. Transsexual is when it passes to this sex reassignment or hormone therapy or whatever that changes its appearance on a morphic level. And yes, I'm sorry if I said dysmorphia, it's my English. But what I wanted to say is that gender dysphoria, yes, is when it has some sort of distress due to its own gender. This according to the American Psychological Association. And if you want to have facts, we can give you facts also. Studies have shown that between 16 and 32% of transgender men and women have attempted suicide. Why? It's because they're not being accepted. Why? Because this narrative of discrimination that is presenting really a lot in the society.
Okay, I would like to explain why your posture is discriminatory, because it is being the main argument is that maturity is not enough in children to the to determine their own sex, okay, but their own gender. Sorry, but there are not prejudices stated, just the fact that they are not mature enough, and this maturity ends up being irrelevant because because actually these decisions make a new learning process, a new you learn something by changing your gender legally, and if you regret it, or if you say, okay, I don't want to be a woman anymore, and you change it again, okay? So there's not prejudice, there's actually a learning process which helps even more to be more mature and
even farther than a learning process, which is a very noticeable point, we would also have the fact that, number one, identification with the ideologies of the person, because again, we're talking about that our gender refers to something that is personal, that is in our minds, and it refers to the perception that we have of ourselves. And therefore, it has nothing to do with what the external factors give us, but rather what we personally think and what we personally do. And that has to do with something that it's so important for transgender people, which is to feel okay in their state, something that they can most likely not achieve because, for example, their ID cards state a gender which they don't feel identified. And upon making this able to be identified or changing this, they can be identified and eliminate this negative perspective that has existed, and that the state important point can fix, just as we mentioned earlier. And something that I also want to mention is the fact that from the other side, the opposition, they ask us for arguments, but in the same way, they haven't given any arguments. The only thing that they have given are some facts, some data, with their sources, but they never connect them to the topic with the reasoning. More with a teaching intention, when we debate, we have to make use of arguments, and the structure of an argument goes affirmation or assertion, reasoning, and the source or the evidence. And so far, they have only ever been able to mention the evidence, but haven't mentioned the reasoning nor the assertion.
Opposite table, it is impossible that the suicidal rate among transgender community is around to 30 to 50% higher than the general suicide rate. It is impossible just because people are mean to them. It's impossible.
Yes, it's possible that if someone is mean to you, you want to kill yourself. That's how depression works. I'm sorry if I misunderstood, and I as the moderator, to not make those kind of gestures, just to the respect of this debate. We're doing it also. But yes, if someone is not allowing you to be who you are, if someone is discriminating you, first your parents, then the state, then the society, then your friends, then all of these people, of course you would maybe get depression. And if you get depression, you get clinical depression, you are most likely to commit suicide. And you want a fact, I just give you a fact. I cannot argue with facts. I can argue with the reasoning.
Well, opposite table, you just mentioned that, well, children are discriminated, and first of all, we're not talking only about children, but also about minors. And opposite table, well, people is mean to people. People are mean to people in any situation, anytime. And just because they're transgender is not a justification to make it like even a bigger issue. It is an issue, but it's still not because of transgender, but because people are mean. Also, opposite table, minors are not legally considered as citizens because they do not vote. So you cannot put them in that way.
Okay, so people are mean to people all the time. So that is saying we should be mean to people, and we should keep on doing this. So if we took the example of the being mean to black people in the 50s, we are taking the same meanness to the actual transgender community. the transgender community is not only about suicides, but it's also about murder rates. So they get murdered because they are not legally a woman, but they dress like a woman and then they identify as a woman. And this takes us to the third argument, the benefit to the society. When we allow the woman to vote, we visualize the woman, and we recognize the woman as a person, and we recognize them as that. And allowing non-straight couples to get married are also a visualization. So we need to keep on going for the benefits of the LGBT community.
Opposite table. What we said before is that the suicidal rate is still high once the person is already a transgender, not because of not being transgender. And we didn't state that their parents are against their decision. They're just giving time to time because they love their children and they want them to be right. And also you mentioned kids. When you're 5, the other children still don't understand what's going on. So they are preventing them from suffering maybe bullying, and they're just preserving their mental health. A parent loves their child. Stop saying they are against them.
If my parents wouldn't let me to have a girlfriend or to be lesbian, it probably the reason it would be, yes, because they may hate homosexuals or whatever, and also because they love me, because they don't want me to suffer. They don't want me, when I go to school, people look at me in very weird way, in ugly ways. And yes, people are mean to people, and in some cases, specifically in transgender people, it is because they're transgender. If you know that someone in your classroom is transgender, is transsexual, is a lesbian, is I don't know, whatever, you may look at them in a weird way, you may talk to them really mean, you may, in some other cases, you can do bullying. This because the people is different than you. This is what the narrative in the worldwide is telling us. This is why the LGBT community itself exists as a community.
Opposite table, we think you have a misconception about what we are debating. We are not against the LGBT community. We are not against them. We are not against transgender people. We are against minors being able to legally change sex, gender, without parent consent. How crazy is that? Minors who are not allowed to vote, to drink alcohol, to own a car and get a tattoo, but yet being able to choose if they want a sex reassignment surgery. They are not mature enough to take this important decision that is going to be what they're going to live the rest of their lives.
Well, 2 points here. Number one is that discrimination is actually, and this is a fact, is especially bad against people who don't cope or who are not in acceptance of the ideas that society generally has. And it's of course true that transgender people are not in the conception of what is normal for society, and this is not necessarily bad, but society makes it bad, and that is the point that we should solve. We should solve the discrimination, which in not any moment is solved by what the opposition presents, and for that it is a bad measure what they're presenting. And the second point, and this is more like an invitation to the opposite table, is to give variations to the debate, because from the beginning you have not ever mentioned anything else than legal sex change, and that's the only thing you have talked about, but you have never ever mentioned anything else, nor presented any arguments that go on other things, being that we did consider the benefits for the state, for the society, for the same transgender people, and also for the general LGBT community.
Opposite table, you just mentioned that we were stuck in one point, which is transsexual and sexual assignment surgery. That's because when we mentioned it, you completely avoided the subject, despite the fact that it is in the sheet that was sent to every single one of us debating here. So, opposite table, we wanted to make a point of it because it's extremely obvious that you do not come with information, so you chose to say that it was not mentioned in the posture. Also, you mentioned that dating a girl or a boy should be respected. Yes, it should, but we're talking about legal matters, not about dating or relationships. Please stop comparing dating and relationships to legal matters, because that's just not in the same level of importance. Also, you mentioned that discrimination would be worse and stuff. Well, if a 10-year-old boy enters his classroom with a girl's name, wouldn't that be a start for more bullying as an opposite, as a rhetorical question?
Okay, so then again, 2 points I want to present here, and the first one is you say, or the opposition table says, please do not compare legal matters. Okay, in the same way, please do not compare transgender or changing your gender to something like drinking alcohol, having sex, etc. Because, of course, just as you said, it's not the same case and it does not apply to the same rules. And also, trying to answer what they just the opposition said about we never presenting thing, is that okay? Well, there's a very important point that we have to consider in this debate, and that is discrimination, something that they have mentioned just right now, and they say, okay, maybe if you enter with the name of a girl instead of a boy to a classroom, being that you previously were a boy, it may be a reason for discrimination, and it would just as you said, it falls on your contradiction in the way that you said, okay, people will still be mean to people, and that is true, but this case is especially bad, and it's not the same the bullying that some people make to other people than people make to transgender people.
Opposite table, well, there is discrimination in the black community, yet the suicidal rate is from 2%, while the trans community is 46%. How can you explain that? And therefore, there is no there is no single source that proves that bullying and discrimination causes that amount of suicides.
So I think the comparison is weird because we are comparing the discrimination on already. It's not the same discrimination a black person suffers and a transgender person suffers. Again, it's not only suicide rates; it's also the murder rates, which I can find right now, but it's weird. So the discrimination the discrimination you say it's possible to suffer within like changing the name of a girl entering to a classroom is what we're trying to normalize. It's what we're trying to fight for, because if the state gives the legitimacy to that transgender community, if the state gives the legitimacy to the gender of the boy, if the state gives the legitimacy of that, it would become normalized, and it would help the discrimination. And I don't see why no, we should not be like avoiding to discriminate someone, and I don't see why we would put above everything else than the discrimination they're suffering and the negative consequences it brings to to them and to the community.
Well, of course, opposite discrimination is presented in different ways, but we're talking about the same consequence, which is depression. And as my table team just already say, the suicidal rates are still high once the minor has become transgender. And in these cases, depression needs to be treated psychologically. And of course, they need support of the people that loves them the most, which are in these cases, their parents, the legal tutor.
Some points very clear to finish this debate, this state of the debate, are, first of all, the knowledge about psychological process. Depression can be caused if someone is legally, sexually, or whatever, in any way transgender. Why? Because the person itself can feel most of the time gender dysphoria, which is distress due to one's gender. Another point is the comparison that I've been doing once and over again is between being a lesbian or a gay man or whatever to being transgender. Why? Because I'm comparing the discrimination that this group suffers, the LGBTQ plus community suffers. Why? Because people don't accept them because of the variation of the sexual identity or gender identity. Second point I wanted to make really fast is the difference between a fallacy and if something is false. If something is false, is that it's just not true. If I say the sky is pink, that's false. That's not a fallacy. A fallacy is a logical mistake. And I just wanted to make something really clear that the opposition table has been making over and over and over again is the insufficient reference accidental fallacy, which basically consists on applying one rule indiscriminately in all cases. And in this case, you're saying, oh, minors are not allowed to drink, they're not allowed to vote, they're not allowed to drive, and whatever other things that minors can do. Therefore, minors should not be able to change their gender. I'm just trying to make this point that this is a logical fallacy. This has a mistake on the logical reasoning.
Opposite table, as we mentioned before, we are not against the LGBT community. We are just concerned in the part of passing over parental consent. Why would a minor be mature for something such as sex reassignment, but not mature to vote? As a rhetorical question, there is a non-existing congruence here.
Some point that they mentioned a few minutes ago and that they just brought up again is the fact that we would be skipping the authority of our parents. However, if the state, and that's a point that we have to make very clear, is the major authority. Even your parents have no authority if the state states so. And the point here is that, okay, if we as a state give legitimacy to the child, to the children, now, even if their parents don't agree, because we have to make something clear, parents will most likely not agree with this conception because the conception of the parents and the conception of the individual, the children, might be much different, and this can cause problems. We already explained that. The point here is, if we give legitimacy to the children being the state, then we can help eliminate that discrimination. And even if we play on the side that they are not mature enough, the state can give many mechanisms such as accompanying the children psychologically and in many other ways, preventing the discrimination, and this ultimately helps solve the problem much better than it does on the opposite side, which is why it falls to our side, all of those points.
Well, opposite table, it seems like it's not quite clear yet that we're not against the LGBT community or against transgender community. We're against letting children decide without their parents' consent. And the comparison with drinking, voting, and driving is because they are legal matters, not like relationships or dating, which are not. Drinking, voting, and driving are legal matters, and we're putting them as context because it is not a fallacy of whatever type you can mention, because it's just put in context what is happening in the legal matters, which is what we are debating, not whether they're discriminated or not. Also, the state doesn't always look for the best interest of their population, just as we can see in countries such as Mexico. So that's quite not correct to say that all the governments will look for the best interest of their citizens.
Okay, as a rhetorical question, if your dad loves you, should he hit you or something? Because I think this discrimination of not letting your child become transgender, it's just the logic of that. If your parents love you, they should be the ones that take all of your life into their hands, I think. And I think that it's not correct. That ends when their parents are being discriminatory and kind of violent to the children. So so again, I would like to go again on all of our arguments that it would be a benefit to the child, a benefit to the society, and a benefit for the government, and maybe to all of this. And I think, or we think, that we are still not debating the sex reassignment, and we are still not debating the facts that you present, and those facts that you present, that the opposite table presents, that are not arguments.
Well, just to state various points opposite table, We are not generalizing. It's a fact that minors have completely brain level, well, the human has a complete brain development until they are 24. So we're not generalizing that one kid is more mature than the other, or they are all not mature. It's established. And also, of course, they can be transsexual, but when adults, if we let them decide, why not considering them adults already? As a rhetorical question, opposite table. And another point, we are talking about who you are, not the sexual preference, which is a different matter, opposite table. And we just state a fact, as you've been asking us, we've also been asking. Parents can be kept in Polynesia, Argentina, Malta, Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia.
Now, we're going to final disclosures, the closing statements. To finish this debate, each of the table will vote the closing statements. We remind you, you should not take longer than 10 minutes. Starts opposition.
First of all, we would like to thank everyone for your time and attention to this debate, to the jury, the moderator, and of course the opposite table. We acknowledge and appreciate the respect, cordiality, and the good debate we had today. We would like to restate that we're completely and absolutely against letting children decide whether to become a legal transgender in society without their parents' consent. This is because all the arguments that were mentioned, even though the opposite will try to invalidate them by saying that they were not true or fallacies, even though we brought a lot of references that were mentioned throughout the debate, while the opposite didn't. Okay, despite the fact that it was a hard-fought debate, and we appreciate it, we can assure that the opposite completely failed to prove their point, as we can tell that they failed to make their facts stand because it was all based on opinions and on contradicting what we say without a solid base. Also, the issue in this debate that we could notice is that the opposite table did not read the whole posture which was sent to them. They only read the justification. In the posture, it is exactly said that we're also against letting children go through a sexual assignment surgery without their parents' consent. It is written in the posture, and the opposite table kept denying it, and that's because the lack of information. As they did not counter it, they preferred to omit that part, which was fundamental for this debate. Also, there's no way to justify the fact that children are, well, as they are minors, there are several legal complications that could come to them, and by letting them decide whether to become legally transgender, well, without the parents' permission is completely and absolutely wrong, as we mentioned throughout the whole debate with several arguments, fundamented and facts, rather than just opinions and phrases such as we think. Also, they kept using the phrase, become a transgender. Opposite table, this just shows how little comprehension do you have about the subject, because you do not become a transgender, you are a transgender. The correct term would be become a transgender legally, but you omitted that part, which changed the whole context of the part. And the posture. It is completely unethical and wrong to state that a child or a minor can't become legally transgender without the parents' permission, because as you mentioned in our question, parents are needed, tutors are needed to help them decide and guide them. There is no discrimination. Nobody is telling them you cannot do things, or they're not forbidding them to do stuff. They are just procuring the best for their children. If they see a child or a minor and they are not quite sure, but take a decision, because they can be easily influenced by the media, the internet, all that stuff which has happened several times. For example, there's a testimony of a girl who saw this guy who became a girl in YouTube, and she tried to do the same, but the opposite. She became a guy, and then she noticed that she was wrong. She did not have her parents' permission, so there was no way to back up her decision, as it was not legally accepted. And she had to suffer through a lot of things because of the lack of the tutor's backup, which is totally and absolutely necessary for the minor. And as you stated, a legal tutor is fundamental for every minor to perform in society as a person. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so to end this debate, I really think we should make a point very clear. And it is that all of the case presented by the opposition is based on the same fact that since that they omit completely discrimination. Discrimination in their case will always exist and will never be solved under the premises that they present, because a point has to be made very clear. They always only presented premises, never got to the arguments, and much in the same way, throughout the whole debate, they utilized the fallacy ad hominem fallacy. Okay, so all that they said, you don't know the information. Since they don't know, the information, they rather omit it and no debate. And okay, of course, those are attacks, personal attacks towards this team, and we certainly invite the judges to put the necessary penalties that are given for that. And much in the same way, we have to consider the fact, and this is something that we mentioned throughout the beginning of the debate, and that is discrimination. Discrimination exists in the status quo, is not going to be solved by the propositions from this side, but on this side, we have the necessary things to move towards solving discrimination. And this discrimination, just as we presented and noted that the comparisons presented by this team were not really adjunct to the debate, they didn't enter because, okay, they tried to present things that are legal and stuff, but they never conclude in something that is special and never tell us how we should and not do, which way, because also in theory of debate, if you are in the opposition team, you have to make a proposal of how to do things, not just to say, oh no, it's not because it's bad. You have to make some points clear, something that they never did throughout the debate. And as a society, and also as a state, and as persons from the LGBT community, we should strive to eliminate the problems that people nowadays face. Because if we don't strive to do that, if we'll never solve them. And these narratives of discrimination, of not letting people do what they want and feel what they want. Because, of course, identifying yourself with something is always inside the legal things that you can do. If I feel identified with a girl, I can feel identified with a girl, and there is no legal thing that can prohibit me from doing that. And under the case that on the other side they present us, these things happens. We are restricted to do what we want. We are restricted to feel like we want, and we are restricted to identify ourselves with what we really are. Because I think that that was the highest ad hominem they said, which on the beginning of their statements they mentioned, we are only about it's not about feeling identified with something we are not. And I think that is extremely offensive, both for the people who are transgender and for the people who really think this is something that we should do. I thank you all for being here, and I say goodbye.
Sí, 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 yo sé, yo sé.